I'm big, but I got a little voice.
All right, Mike Tyson.
Mike Tyson doesn't really have a little voice.
It's a little high-pitched voice, I think.
Oh, I guess.
Kind of a joke about him.
I have the opposite of a little voice. I have a booming monster of a voice.
Whereas I just have a voice, and I'm surely the other side of this quartet. I know.
Do we both count as two?
I'm thinking almost at our sizes, we are two people each.
I'm two fat people.
Yeah, and I'm just too fucking tall for my own damn good.
So yes, I am big. He is surly, and we are starting season 3, media literacy.
And why do we need media literacy is the topic of episode 1. Now, media is kind of more your thing. I'm more of an outsider from the media point of view. So, I mean, what is media literacy?
Media literacy would be the psychological equivalent of health literacy.
Of what?
Health literacy.
Okay.
So, this is a cigarette. It contains carcinogens and delicious tobacco. If I light it and smoke it,
which he's about to do because he's a bad influence, and this is the 1980s for him still.
If anybody looks at me and starts smoking because I do, they have bigger problems than
That's
that.
Probably true. Peer pressure is an interesting topic, but yeah.
But I'm now taking in carcinogenic smoke.
So I mean, what you're
everything you watch, everything you listen to is just that, but for your mind. So this podcast is in and itself. I am a subscriber personally to the viral model of information sharing, and in general, it kind of extends to intelligence at large. But that ideas infect us and change our perspective.
Kind of the memetic theory of idea transmission from in anthropology.
And that's what we're trying to do on this show, is to get you to be aware of the world around you, at least to some degree from our perspectives. Yeah. Because that's all we really ultimately have.
We're trying to teach fish to see water. And really, that is what media literacy is about when you're inundated with media all day, all the time, is to recognize the forces that are operating on your psyche.
And to either rebuff them or to accept them based on their value for you, intellectually, spiritually, and I mean, even from just a mental health standpoint. We need to be aware of what we're taking into our brains.
This is not the COVID. I'm always a little bit under the weather. That's just part of my health issues. And I mean, it does affect the mental part of people when the mental aspect, the mental health of people, this media environment, the fear mongering, the lying, the spin, the literal distortion of perception that is constantly around us. I mean,
one of the major themes of our last season was that poor people are essentially taught to view themselves as bad.
That's true.
Deserve their plight because they are poor people.
The victim blaming is very much a part of our society. And media has been instrumental in propagating this idea that the value of a person is dependent upon their role rather than the fact that they are a living being amongst other living beings. And a lot of people view this as kind of like the left wing bullshit sort of thing, but uh, we've come back into a society where we have to question our own values about how we value everything around us when the decisions that we're allowing our government to make, spearheaded by media propaganda, is throwing our most vulnerable and oppressed citizens under the bus. And I mean, that our governments have turned on us after us letting them beat the shit out of the rest of the world for decades on end is not a huge surprise. I mean, this is end state capitalism. To take that approach to it, and this is where neoliberalism ends, with a few big fish who are incredibly bloated swimming in a dead ocean.
Because consumer societies don't function if you have no consumers.
Yeah, I mean that's a basic principle of it, is if there is nobody to consume, then there is no need for consumption. What we don't understand is that an economy is what happens after a surplus develops. And the way that we've built our economy is that we're relying on a few having
Cat's buttholes.
The cat is really bad for this sort of shit. We're relying on a few who have an incredible amount to make the world better for everybody, but that's not what's actually happening. What's happening is we're seeing vast hoarding of resources. We are seeing tent cities, the likes in North America we haven't seen since the Great Depression. There's a lot of issues going on. So
our companies letting entire regions fall into disrepair to the extent that a storm wipes out power for a huge swath of the country.
Yeah, Texas last winter is a prime example. I mean, these sorts of things, how are they happening? Why aren't people more informed on them is a question. And the answer to the question is because the people who we get our information from have vested interests in us not actually getting the full information. Like in Canada, we have places like CTV and CBC. Sorry about all the sniffing and stuff. Who have been caught basically running corporate propaganda, and they've been doing this for a long time. Like they use like people from companies without saying that they're from companies. So with like they introduce folks without telling people about the biases that these folks might have, and the bias leans towards corporations up here in Canada. And
same in the US.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, if anything, the bias of the talking heads of the mainstream media in the United States lean towards sensationalism because the presumption is sensationalism sells.
But
and so they manipulate things so that the sensational is transmitted as news. Like CNN showing up for every hurricane with a massive team of people to look at the destruction, and it's almost like a natural disaster for CNN. Or Fox News creating hysteria about non-existent problems because it appeals to their viewership.
Well, I mean, we have even more insidious stuff. Like we have billionaires literally buying, or corporations literally buying out news outlets. If you look up Bill Gates, for example, Bill Gates gives millions upon, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars to newspapers. And other billionaires like Murdoch openly owns newspapers. And these people, to a large degree, or you have Bloomberg. Bloomberg is a billionaire who is actually associated with Epstein, if I recall correctly. So when you are looking at media, it is really not even just what are they making, it's who are they working for, whose agenda are they working for. I mean, Reuters, Reuters, and CNN, and I think most American media press outlets now have CIA representatives working on their boards of directors and whatnot. So, I mean, we're seeing a growing, especially now with this whole COVID thing going on, honestly, if you look with social media, it's basically been made open for everyone to see that these people are working in ways that are fairly intentional to create wars. Like Reuters was working with the UK government to run anti-Russian propaganda. Jesus, Ginger. She's like this all the time. We had not CNN, we had, in my own province, we had Pam Frampton from the Telegram running stories about feminism in Afghanistan during the fallout, which the CIA was actually was using feminism to get the left on board for global wars, is also a known factor. So, I mean, there's collaboration between the military industrial complex and media. There's collaboration between corporations and media, and there's collaborations between government and media.
And we can't forget that media itself is a corporate entity.
Yeah, well, depends. I mean, there's social media. Those are corporate entities for sure. What did you mean specifically, though?
That CNN is a major money source for their umbrella corporation. I don't know who owns CNN at this point.
And Pfizer is a big funder of CNN, which is
through advertising.
Yep. Well, I mean, funding is funding, dude. You do not piss off the funding. Like here in Newfoundland, there was a fellow who had a radio program that was really popular. And then one day he did something that was against the oil companies here. Actually dared to criticize the great and grand oil companies and got his ass fired. So, and a lot of people speculate, from my understanding, like people I've talked to, is that a lot of people think he was fired because he spoke out, actually dared to speak up. So, I mean, that's a real issue too. Is like, you cannot offend who funds you. You need that money, right? So, I mean, money is a motivator. It's like Pelosi when making huge amounts of money off of the stock market means that it's very hard to trust her as an individual to make unbiased decisions about said stock market, right? Like compared to her salary as a US congressperson, what she makes investing is so much more, you know?
Absolutely.
So, and how is this getting by? Like what the press decides to publish is a huge factor. But you worked with press, right? Like you did the journal, like you just have more.
I did school. I did journalism school.
Okay.
It was one of my many majors. But the good professors in journalism school basically said, don't go to journalism school.
Why is that?
Because it's a waste of time. You can either write with a voice or you can't. It's very difficult to develop the ability to have a voice when writing that has any value. Okay. And that was one point. And the other point they made was that the way you become a journalist is by doing it.
Mm-hmm. So in this day and age of social media, becoming that voice is possible in
Well,
various
this was 20
different
years
methods.
ago. I imagine there's programs that actually are legitimately training, because you can legitimately do investigative journalism now if you crowdsource.
Yeah, that's how I keep an eye on things, is just have a huge number of things that I keep an eye on.
Well,
People
no,
and
I mean
industry.
there are actual investigative journalists that do like GoFundMes for their work.
Yep.
So
These are people I follow. There's people I follow. There's a new one doing inner city news. It's a recent one I found that's doing the Giswell Maxwell case. The Epstein.
Ghislaine Maxwell.
That's who it is. What are some good ones that you follow?
I don't know.
No?
It's my news feed is generally passive.
What do you mean?
Like I delve into issues, not follow a specific journalist.
Okay, but how do you know what are issues?
Mostly the mainstream media is my starting
I
point.
like to
So
see what's
what is
not
being
reported,
discussed? Well,
because that's beyond, because that allows you to see beyond the dichotomy.
absolutely. But for me, it's
Mhm.
like being able to have a conversation about the day's issues is also important in my work.
Mhm.
So being like, I am by nature probably a dilettante.
What's
My
that?
knowledge, well, my knowledge area does like this. It's not a, I'm not deep. I'm not a physicist. I'm not deeply knowledgeable about
Any
just
one
one
subject.
area. Yes,
Okay.
but my like economics, I have basically taught myself everything that they learn in grad school
Mhm.
for like an MBA by reading and studying the same stuff that they studied.
Mhm.
Um, same. So once you learn, I guess my point is, once you learn basic research methodology, which will be one of our episodes for this season, you can pretty much dig into an issue
Mm.
and find multiple perspectives on that issue to get the background on that issue so that you can formulate a base opinion yourself before necessarily you hear other people's opinions. It's just a question of how you go about learning about a subject. And if you do it in a methodical manner, then your ability to understand it will be much deeper. At least that's how it works for me.
Yeah. And I mean that there has been a fair amount of research that this whole learning styles of different people is actually kind of garbage. The people just learn pretty much the same despite what they think a preferred style may or may not be. Okay.
Well, we both actually taught. You don't think learning styles is a real thing
It isn't demonstrably under science.
based on what science?
I can get it to you. There's a
Okay,
fair body on it.
we'll link that underneath here,
All right, one
and
second.
maybe we'll come back to that. But and your chair is super squeaky.
I know.
You need to gut that cat and use its intestines to lubricate your chair.
Probably need a new chair. It's getting a bit old.
Don't be, man. I can literally hear people going, "What?
What?
Don't gut the cat." I'm being euphemistic.
I know. That wasn't even acknowledging that remark.
I just heard the internet outrage because you can't be mean to kitties on the
Oh,
internet or
yeah.
you'll
Well,
die.
you're the bad person. I'm the one with the cat.
Yes, that's true. That is true. I have a puppy. I'm
I'm also
slightly more
going to
normal.
be just making a few notes here because I'm also going to be linking the U.S. linking CIA on the board, on news boards. And I
Yeah,
mean, this is a real issue. Like, it's what knowing what you can believe is one of the primary, knowing who you can trust to have put in the work and to admit a mistake if they fuck up is probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do when it comes to media literacy, because it's a culture. It's a toxic culture. I suspect it's quite a bit like law, where there is the problems with law start at a cultural level before it even gets to the problems elsewhere. You know what I mean?
sure. Well, let's do lesson number one right now. Lesson
Yeah.
number one, objectivity is fucking bullshit. There is no such thing as true objectivity about anything outside of like math or hard science that can be repeated multiple times under the same experimental circumstances. Beyond that, it's all some degree of opinion. The question is, with your news source,
So you can,
how much opinion are you getting? And to what degree are you aware of that predisposition, of
yeah.
that inherent bias, uh, outlook, perspective, whatever you want to call it, depending on it, its scale of nefarious to attempting objectivity. It's really ultimately just a question of being aware of those two things. What is their bias, and to what degree is that bias affecting what they're writing?
And that is not even, and I understand why people like to look at it that way because it's an individual sort of area. But I actually disagree with you a bit there. I think the most important thing you can learn is the controlling what is the bias controlling the corporate entity. Because whatever the corporate entity's bias is, it will permeate all of the reporting and how stories are reported within that particular agency.
Sure, but that's part of that individual reporter's bias as well.
Right, but it's easier to get a corporate, it's easier to understand it's easier to analyze the news coming out of a corporation than it is to analyze the news coming out of an individual. Because you'll be able to see contradictory stories going up in parallel often, or you'll see, as has been the hilarious case from some YouTube videos, of talking heads on television from very different news stations, all repeating the identical message that has been handed down to them.
Sure,
Have you ever seen
Newsmax
that?
does that all the time.
Have you ever seen that? Like those montages of like fucking like 40 faces on the screen, all speaking the exact same words as if they're like. So I mean,
It's an old Daily Show bit. John Oliver uses it regularly.
yeah. So I mean, it is fairly common knowledge right now. So it doesn't matter what the individual journalists are doing when this is what's actually happening behind the scenes.
And
Like,
that applies if, I guess we don't need to go down this rabbit hole of arguing perspective, because really we're ultimately saying the same thing. It's either the bias of the entity that's providing the news, or it's the bias of the reporter, or it's some combination thereof.
well, I mean, the entity itself would discriminate in its own hiring practices to hire people like itself. And this is again where the cultural concept is more dominant than the individual perspective. I've seen writings on it before where there's been a criticism of that one of the reasons we don't get a diverse view on the news is that news is typically pursued by socioeconomic class plus skin color, and that these people hire people more like themselves in how they think and report. So that is another reason that we're seeing underreporting, is that we're actually seeing a class and a subculture develop within the press itself that is self-sustaining.
Sure, I can believe that's feasible. I mean, that's how society works. You get increased specialization when you have more production.
Well, when you see increased monopoly-like conditions as well. I mean, while
Sure.
the small press is being bought up, we have most of global press owned by, I think, 3 corporations at this point.
God, I thought it was 5.
I thought it went down to 3 over the pandemic. I'm gonna look that
Did
up.
it?
I
Okay.
will post how, well, it'll be linked in where this is. I think it's 3, might be 5.
Still, it used to be 6. And 6 was a shocking number.
Yeah.
But takes us back to season 1, and the problem with neoliberalism is the increased concentration of the mantle of control of production, the mantle of control of capital, the mantle of control of just power in general into increasingly fewer hands.
It was Rockefeller in the 1920s, right before the crash, who said it doesn't matter who rules, it matters who has the money. Like basically stating that with money you can control the world. And I mean, in the 1960s era, you used to see this because you wouldn't find a tycoon who didn't want have ambitions of having their own newspaper. And it has become an incredible form of astroturfing and propaganda in our modern age. Social media has been the first thing to disrupt media narrative since the Vietnam War, I would say.
This is if I have a general criticism of social media, it's that it made astroturfing an art form.
It already was. It's just they made it available to people who didn't have access to it before. I mean,
But you
media.
used to do that sort of manipulation. You used to have to like pay people to go out to a bar and say some stupid bullshit so that it would get repeated.
Or you
Now
just
they
had
can do it
CII.
just online.
Yeah, I guess. It's see, the thing is I think that social
The
media
flat
has,
earthers never would have gotten enough a past the threshold to where they would actually be discussed in the Overton window sense of it. Like the Overton window is this political science idea that it's a spectrum between which what is considered absurd or too idealistic fits inside this window, and that's the acceptable discussion for most political speech. But you have like what's absurd, the window, lots of people have made the Overton window massive. Like Trump helped make the Overton window huge with his behavior.
before Trump, I was working on widening it.
The internet and social media have basically made it so that conspiracy theories can be taken as fact because the brain can't help but believe a lie it's told so many times.
See, I mean, there have been, I would say don't write off all conspiracy theories. I mean, who is it? Common Grounds? There's this group I follow, a news media outlet that does has one person who basically reports news from the right, one person who reports it from the left. They did a deep dive into Bill Gates, and like that motherfucker's nefarious. Like the shit
Sure,
he
he's
gets
a
up to is
billionaire.
brutal.
Anybody who's a billionaire is going to be up to some seriously
He
sketchy
basically
business.
controls third world health.
Yeah, that's fucked up.
Yeah, like this guy has bought entire generations of press through funding schools and providing jobs, like the hand that feeds via billions of dollars, both journalism and medicine. I mean, when this COVID thing broke out, he sat down with 12 heads of pharmaceuticals and fucking planned out their response. Like that vaccine um, stockpile that they built for poor countries, that was his idea. And it was only supposed to get like 20% of their population vaccinated. But I mean, this whole thing of keeping patents going is something he's a real big part of. Like, this guy is a dick, from what I can tell. Like, I mean, they're just, he's like, most of them are fairly open about it, but he's tried to hide it. Like, he's real subtle about his nefarious bullshit.
Right. If you're a billionaire, you're probably a scumbag. I don't. You have almost certainly had another human being killed or inadvertently resulted through your actions in the death of another human being.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that whole fucking thought experiment. Would you push a button knowing that someone would die if you got $1 million? The billionaires are basically pushing that button so fast, heat's coming out of it.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Friction.
these are not admirable individuals as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, that's stuff about, and for people who are interested in more stuff on Gates's vaccine and press links, I'll include both videos in the whatchamacallit below this. Because I mean, that's stuff people should know
That's
about.
actually what that area is technically known as for those of you who don't,
What's that?
make videos. The whatchamafucker
Yeah.
is that section
That is a
in
tried and
specific.
true Newfoundland term. If you come to Newfoundland and say, pass me the whatchamafucker or the whatchamacallit next to the thingamajigger, they will probably hand you the thing you were asking for.
So you're saying all newfies are somehow psychic?
No, we're just used to each other.
Still might be psychic. It's the sea.
Yeah.
Maybe you're all of Poseidon's blood.
Yeah, whatever. We're all it's a very small island. Although it's like
You're like
actually
Percy
bigger than
Jackson.
South Korea. It's like 10,000 square kilometers bigger than South Korea, which is astounding. We got like 500,000 people. They got like 50 plus million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Korea's pretty full of people.
Yeah, it really is. And that's the island, I'm pretty sure. Not Newfoundland and Labrador, just Newfoundland Island. And it's a big island, but that's a small country with a lot of people. And I mean, to bring it back before we finish off.
Yeah, we have really wandered here.
Actually, I think we've done a really good job overall of touching on stuff while having a decent, engaging conversation.
We have tapped on all the points that we're going to later delve deep on.
Yeah. And I mean, why we need to have media literacy is like a very important point in and of itself. Like it is much more common knowledge these days, with most people having a healthy distrust of mainstream media these days, but it applies to all media. Everybody's going to make mistakes. Everybody has viewpoints, and a lot of them are trying to sell something, and that can cloud thinking, and that can cause issues. So, I mean, media literacy, like taking everything everybody says with a grain of salt, is like a really good idea. when you're we'll talk about how you actually dissect certain articles later on, but I think saying that you just cannot trust anything out the gate is probably the safest way to look at it.
That might be lesson number one. Don't trust anything at face value.
Yeah, research it as best you can.
Because this applies not just to news media, but this applies to all the media that you consume. This applies to the movies that you watch. They are selling you product. One of my favorite examples of this, and I don't know if you, dear listener and viewer, if you've ever seen Treehouse Masters, the show where they build tree houses. It's pretty great, actually.
Okay.
But clearly,
you tried to make me watch Amish Mafia, and since then I have a big distrust of your taste in shows.
Amish Mafia is amazing, and you're wrong if you don't like it. It is so ridiculous and absurd. It is hilarious. But Treehouse Masters would often have this weird breakdown where the guy was driving from like work site to work site, and he'd be in his truck and he'd start talking about how great his truck was to the person riding with him. Like, man, this truck is great. Look at this. And you're like,
product placement.
Yeah, that is a pretty great truck. And then immediately after that, it would go to a commercial of that truck because that truck is helping to pay for the production of that TV show.
Product placement. And I mean, selling stuff. We're surrounded by that all the time. You see them.
They do product placement on news shows now.
Yeah. Oh, do they really? I don't watch news anymore.
Like the like Fox and Friends and shows like that where they sit around and talk.
Fox isn't news.
Sure. None of it.
Sorry, Fox and Friends is just like a talk show
where they discuss the news because they're somehow experts.
There is.
But my point is, like, sometimes they'll all have a Pepsi on the table. And it's like Pepsi advertising to those viewers.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like the soccer player who took the Pepsi bottles off of his thing and held up water and got fucking reamed out for it because Coke or Pepsi was paying for it. God forbid you not have it on that table.
Yep.
But I mean, who is it? I think the Pepsi or Coke were like deemed the worst plastic polluters several years in a row at this point. So I mean, like,
you want to go down a Google rabbit hole like I do and start to learn research methodology, look up Coca-Cola Death Squad.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
That was down in a southern country, wasn't it?
Just
down
start at Google. Yeah, multiple.
Oh.
They have had like paramilitary forces and gangs go after union organizers in multiple countries in South America.
I believe that slavery, torture, and rape are part of our supply chains. And until this is the thing, we have such deeply embedded hypocrisy in our society. Like we talk out both sides of our faces, and I mean, even
you want jobs to come back to America. Tell every company that sells something in America that they have to pay their workers X amount of dollars or their products cannot be sold in our country.
I think
those jobs will come back to the United States overnight, because why would they keep their factories in Asia if they have to ship the goods to the United States? It would be much easier to not have to ship the goods as far, and better for the economy. So a global minimum wage is a solution to some of the problems. They're not going to keep the jobs offshore if they have to pay an American living wage to them.
Yeah. So the problem is like between the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, the geopolitical crisis, we literally need to rethink our economy because it's killing us. Like how are, anyway, that's an entirely different conversation. We've gotten off
That's a
track.
season.
Yeah, seriously. I think we've covered everything we need to cover today. So I've been
So
surly.
we've touched on what we'll elaborate further on as the season progresses, how to spot bias, how to find indicators of bias,
What are
how to
the biases?
how to dissect a piece of news to actually get the fundamental truth out of it, not the puffy, fluffy nonsense. Who are some good sources? I also think we should, as part of this, teach people how not to be trolled.
Why?
Just because, why not social media literacy as much as media literacy?
Sure, we can add that. I mean, the whole abuse of social media by government, corporate, and private interests has been fairly astounding. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So we're going to touch on all these issues. We will see you later on for those episodes, and like, share, subscribe. Those are the
That's
three
the
things
other
we're
three,
supposed to
isn't
say,
it?
right?
Yeah. Anyway, well, he's been big.
I have been big. He has been surly.
I've actually been pretty decent. Thank you very much.
You've been placated by cat.
Yeah, the cat invaded. See you later, boys.
Bye.